the day my brother told me I was no longer welcome in my own family's company. He was wearing my grandfather's watch. I noticed it the moment I walked into the boardroom. That old Hamilton pocket watch, the one Grandpa Emmett had carried every single day for 40 years, the one he wound every night before bed without fail. It was now sitting on my brother's wrist in a brushed silver case my brother must have had custom mounted. Like a trophy. Like he'd already divided up everything that mattered before I'd even sat down. I was 29 years old. I'd spent the last 6 years working inside Reed and Callaway Contracting, the company my grandfather had built from nothing in Sudbury, Ontario. I wasn't just an employee. I was the one who managed the subcontractor relationships. I was the one who stayed late renegotiating bids when the steel costs went sideways. I was the one my grandfather would call at 7 in the morning just to talk through a decision, not because he needed my answer, but because he said I helped him think straight. My brother was 2 years older than me and had spent most of those 6 years in the company's Vancouver office managing what was, generously, a regional sales division with 3 accounts and a part-time assistant. My mother sat at the head of the table. She didn't look at me when I came in. "Sit down, Jonah," she said. I sat. There were 2 other people in the room, the company's CFO, a man I'd worked alongside for years, and a lawyer I didn't recognize. The CFO wouldn't meet my eyes either. My brother, whose name is Reed. Yes, my mother named her eldest son after half the company name. She never found that strange. Leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He looked relaxed in the way that people look relaxed when they've already made a decision, and they're just waiting for you to catch up. "We're restructuring," my mother said. "Restructuring," I repeated. "The board has decided to consolidate leadership. Going forward, Reed will be taking over as CEO. I'll remain as chair." I looked at her. Grandpa left the operational leadership to me. That's in his letter of wishes. You were in the room when he said it. His letter of wishes isn't a legally binding document, the lawyer said. I turned to look at him. He had the particular kind of face that seems engineered to deliver news and feel nothing about it. "And the shares?" I asked. My mother finally looked at me. "Redistributed among existing family shareholders, meaning you and Reed." She didn't answer. "So you're telling me," I said slowly, "that I've spent 6 years building relationships, managing projects, turning around contracts that would have collapsed without me, and now I have no shares, no title, and no seat at this table." "You'll receive a severance package," the lawyer said. "I'm not an employee you're laying off. I'm a family member and a partial stakeholder, Jonah." My mother's voice was flat, final. The voice she used when I was 12 and had done something she didn't want to discuss. "This is what's best for the company." I looked at my brother. He was looking out the window at the Sudbury skyline, that watch catching the light on his wrist. He looked bored. He looked the way you look when you've already won, and the formalities are just a courtesy. I picked up the folder on the table in front of me, the one with the severance offer, and I put it back down without opening it. "I'll need time to consult with my own lawyer," I said. "Of course," the unknown lawyer said. I stood up. I thought about saying something to my mother. I thought about asking her, directly, whether she understood what she was doing. Whether she understood that my grandfather would be devastated. Whether she understood that this was not restructuring, it was inheritance fraud dressed in boardroom language. I didn't say any of that. I walked out of the room, and the heavy door closed behind me, and I stood in the hallway for a minute, just breathing. Then I went to my office, boxed up the things that were mine, and left. My grandfather had died 4 months earlier. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in August, gone by November. It was fast and brutal, and he faced it the way he faced everything, quietly, without complaint, with a stubborn focus on the things still in front of him. In his last weeks, when he could still talk, we spent a lot of time together. My mother and Reed visited, but not the way I did. I would sit with him in the afternoons in his house on Ramsey Lake, and we'd just talk. About the company, about decisions he regretted, about what he hoped things would look like after he was gone. One afternoon he told me about a property he owned up north. a fishing cabin near Biscotasing, about 2 hours northwest of Sudbury. He'd bought it in the 1970s, early in his career, and he'd used it as a retreat for years before my grandmother got sick and the trip stopped. He hadn't been back in almost 15 years. "I left it to you," he said. "Just the cabin. The land title's in a separate file, already updated. Your mother knows. Your brother knows. It's yours outright." I told him I didn't care about the cabin, that I cared about him getting better. He smiled at that. "The cabin's not worth much," he said. "Probably nothing, the shape it's in. But it's yours. Go up there sometime." I didn't think about it much after that. I had more pressing things on my mind. Watching him decline, managing the company through the transition, trying to hold things together. When he died, I was focused on grief, not property. But after the boardroom, after I drove home and sat in my apartment with my boxed-up office, things stacked against the wall and that unsigned severance folder on my kitchen table, I thought about the cabin. I called a buddy of mine from university, a guy named Trev who'd done some renovation work before going into environmental consulting. I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about Trev. "So what are you going to do?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe go look at the cabin." "That actually sounds like a reasonable idea," he said. So I went. I drove up on a Thursday in late March. The highway north of Sudbury still had snowpack on the shoulders, the kind of heavy gray March snow that looks like it'll be there until June. I turned off onto a logging road about 40 minutes past Cartier and followed my grandfather's hand-drawn map. He'd given it to me years ago, for a fishing trip we kept meaning to take together and never did, for another 20 minutes until I found the property. The cabin was worse than I expected. It was a one-story structure, maybe 800 square feet, built sometime in the late 60s from the look of the logs. The roof had partially collapsed on one corner. The porch had rotted through in 2 places. Every window either had cracked glass or was boarded up with plywood that had since warped and split. The property around it was choked with 15 years of undergrowth. Birch saplings coming up through what had been the yard, brush piled against the walls, a rusted-out skidoo half buried under a collapsed lean-to at the back. I stood there in my winter boots in the March snow and looked at this wreck of a building and thought, okay, something about that word steadied me. Not "this is fine," because it obviously wasn't. Just okay. This is what I have. This is where I am. Okay. I spent that first day going through the cabin carefully, room by room, cataloging what could be saved and what couldn't. The floor joists in the main room were solid, old-growth spruce, the kind they don't mill anymore, dry as bone. The log walls themselves were in reasonable shape under the weathering. The stone chimney was intact. The damage was mostly surface. The roof, the porch, the windows, the interior finishes which were basically non-existent anyway. My grandfather had not been a decorator. The cabin was a working space, a place to store gear, sleep, cook on a wood stove, get out onto the lake. The interior was bare and practical. A main room with a kitchen along one wall. A small bathroom. 2 bedrooms. The master bedroom was at the back, overlooking the lake. I noticed something odd about it immediately. The room was smaller than it should have been. I knew the exterior dimensions of the cabin. I'd paced them out. The master bedroom took up roughly the right footprint, but the back wall sat about 4 feet in from where the exterior wall should have been. There was no explanation for that. No mechanical room, no utility closet. Just a wall that was in the wrong place. I knocked on it. The sound was hollow. I stood there for a long time, looking at that wall. Then I went back out to my truck, got a flashlight, and came back in. I ran the light along every edge of the wall, floor, ceiling, sides. There was a seam on the left side, barely visible under decades of grime, where the framing didn't quite meet the log wall behind it. I pressed my fingers into it. It flexed slightly. Not a wall, a panel. I found the mechanism on my 3rd pass. A simple hook-and-eye latch, painted over so many times it had nearly disappeared, set about shoulder height on the right side. I worked it loose with a flathead screwdriver, lifted the latch and pulled. The panel swung outward on a pair of old piano hinges. Behind it was a space about 4 feet deep and 12 feet wide, the full width of the bedroom. Rough-hewn shelves along the back wall, a workbench surface at waist height, and on the shelves, stored in a way that spoke of careful intention, 3 metal lockboxes, a wooden crate, a canvas bag that had gone stiff with age, and a large brown envelope sealed with electrical tape. I sat down on the floor right there. It was cold. It was getting dark. I hadn't eaten since a gas station sandwich outside Sudbury. I sat there for a good 5 minutes before I reached for the envelope. My grandfather's handwriting was distinctive, cramped and angular, all capitals, the kind of handwriting that engineers and tradespeople develop from a lifetime of marking measurements on lumber and drawing up site plans. I recognized it immediately on the envelope. Inside were 2 things: a letter addressed to me by name, and a second, thicker document package held together with a rubber band that crumbled when I touched it. I read the letter first. He wrote that he'd put together what he called his true accounting over the years, separate from the company's official records. He'd noticed irregularities in the company's finances as far back as 12 years ago. Money moving through accounts in ways that didn't match the project records, contracts being awarded to vendors he'd never approved, margins that didn't line up. He'd investigated quietly, over time, because he didn't want to believe what he was finding. Eventually, he couldn't deny it. My mother had been systematically redirecting company funds into a series of numbered corporations. Reed had known. It had been going on for years before my grandfather realized, and it had accelerated after he got sick. That the total he'd been able to document, he wrote, was somewhere in the range of $340,000. Not enough to destroy the company, but enough to constitute serious financial fraud under the Criminal Code of Canada. He'd taken the documentation to a lawyer in Toronto, a man he trusted, who had advised him that the evidence was strong, but that pursuing it through the courts would likely destroy the company and the family simultaneously. So he'd made a different choice. He'd left the documentation here, in the cabin, for me to find. "I'm not telling you what to do with this," he wrote. "That's not fair to you, and I know it. But you deserve to know the truth, and you deserve to have the proof in your hands. Whatever you decide, I trust your judgment. I always have." That's not something I said enough when I was there to say it. I read that last sentence 3 times. I put the letter down and looked out the bedroom window at the lake. The ice was still solid, blue-white in the fading light, stretching out toward the tree line on the far shore. I thought about my grandfather winding that watch. 40 years, every night without fail. I didn't go back to Sudbury immediately. I stayed at the cabin for 4 days. Partly it was to think. Partly it was because once I started looking at the structure with a clearer head, I realized there was enough here to work with. The bones were good. My grandfather had built things to last. Even his retreat, even something he'd abandoned, had been built with care. I'd done renovation work during university. Nothing structural, mostly finish work, drywall, flooring, trim. But I knew enough to know what I was looking at, and I had access to resources. Trev came up on the weekend and we went through the cabin together. He knew more than I did about what would need permits, what could be done without, what the priorities were. "Roof first," he said. "Everything else is secondary until the roof is done." "Obviously," I said. "I'm just saying it like a checklist. Roof, then subfloor in the main room, then windows, then you can actually work inside." I had the severance offer still sitting on my kitchen table, unsigned. My grandfather's estate had left me the cabin and a small separate bequest, $22,000, which he'd noted in his will was from a personal savings account separate from any company assets. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something. I told my lawyer, a woman named Sandra, who practiced out of an office on Elm Street in Sudbury, and who had a way of cutting through noise that I respected enormously, about the cabin and about the documents. I didn't tell my mother or my brother. Sandra reviewed the documents and confirmed what my grandfather's Toronto lawyer had told him. The evidence was credible and substantial. It would support a complaint to the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit or a civil action, or both. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to think about it," I said. Take your time, she said. But not too much time. Statutes of limitation aren't infinite. I spent the next 3 months going back and forth between Sudbury and the cabin. I hired a roofing crew out of Chaplow for the structural roof work. That was beyond what I could do safely myself, and did everything else myself or with Trev's help on weekends. We replaced the subfloor. We rebuilt the porch from scratch using treated lumber and local cedar for the decking. We repointed the chimney. We pulled out every window and reframed the openings before installing new units. It was brutal work, especially alone. There were days I woke up at 5:30 in my sleeping bag on a cot in the main room with my hands so stiff from the cold that I had to run them under warm water before I could grip a hammer. There were days I drove into the nearest town, Chaplow, for supplies, and sat in the Tim Hortons there for an hour, just because I needed to be somewhere warm with people. But there was also something happening that I didn't quite have words for at the time. Every piece of rotted wood I pulled out and replaced was a decision made on my own terms. Every window I set level and square was proof that I could do something right without anyone's approval. I had been so inside the company, so enmeshed in the structure my grandfather had built, that I hadn't realized how much of my identity was tangled up in it. Losing it was like losing the ground under my feet. Building something new, even if it was just an old cabin in the bush north of Sudbury, was finding the ground again. The master bedroom I rebuilt entirely. I kept the hidden room, but I opened it up properly, framed it in, added proper shelving, put in a small window facing the lake. The documents I'd already moved to a safety deposit box at my bank in Sudbury. But the space itself I wanted to keep. My grandfather had built it for a reason, and I thought I understood the reason better now than I ever could have before. He'd needed a place that was his, somewhere the complications of his life couldn't follow him, at least not without his permission. By August, the cabin was livable, more than livable. Trev came up with his girlfriend for a long weekend, and the night they arrived, we sat out on the rebuilt porch with beers looking out at Biscotasing Lake in the August dark, the stars absurdly bright, the way they only are that far north. And Trev said, "Your grandfather had good taste." He really did, I said. It wasn't done. There was still interior finishing work, a proper bathroom renovation, trim work throughout. But it was solid. It was warm. It was mine. I had made my decision about the documents by then. I went back to Sudbury on a Tuesday in September and met with Sandra. She'd spent the summer doing her own quiet research, talking to colleagues, reviewing the documents I'd digitized and shared with her. She'd also, she told me, received a call from the same Toronto lawyer my grandfather had retired. He'd tracked her down through the estate files and wanted to be sure someone was looking after my interests. "Your case is strong," she said, "particularly given the paper trail your grandfather assembled. He was meticulous." "He was an engineer," I said. "He documented everything. The question remains what you want to do with it." "I want to call a family meeting," I said. She looked at me over her glasses. "That's one option. I'm not doing this for revenge," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm doing this because the company is real, and it employs real people, and if my mother and brother continue what they've been doing, it's going to collapse in 5 years and those people will be out of work. My grandfather spent 40 years building that company. I'm not going to watch it get hollowed out." Sandra nodded slowly. "That's a coherent position," she said. "It also happens to be a legally defensible one." The meeting happened on a Wednesday morning in October, back in the same boardroom where I'd been pushed out 8 months earlier. My mother, my brother, the CFO, the company's new lawyer, Sandra, and me. I asked Sandra to speak first because I didn't trust myself to stay level if I opened. She laid it out calmly, the documentation, the numbered corporations, the pattern of transfers, the timeline. The room went very quiet. My mother said very carefully, "Where did you get those documents?" "Grandpa left them to me," I said. "In the cabin." My brother said nothing. He'd gone gray under his tan. "We have 2 options on the table," Sandra said. "The first is that this goes to the RCMP and the civil courts, which will take years, cost enormous amounts of money, generate significant press coverage, and very likely result in criminal charges. She let that sit for a moment. The second option is that we resolve this through a binding agreement, full restoration of Jonah's shares and operational role, repayment of the misappropriated funds from personal assets over a structured timeline, independent financial oversight going forward, and a forensic audit of the past 5 years of company financials. And if we agree to option 2, my brother said carefully, nothing goes to the RCMP. That depends on the forensic audit, Sandra said. If the audit reveals that what we have documented is the full extent of it, then no. If it reveals something larger, that changes the calculus. My mother looked at me for a long time. I couldn't read her expression. I don't know if it was anger or shame or something else entirely. I'm not sure those things are always separable. You're doing this to the family, she said finally. I thought about what I wanted to say. I thought about the boardroom 8 months ago, and my grandfather's watch on my brother's wrist, and driving north on Highway 144 with a box of office things in my back seat and no idea what came next. I thought about a cold morning in April pulling rotted floorboards out of a cabin that no one had cared for in 15 years. I thought about my grandfather sitting in his chair on Ramsey Lake, telling me the cabin wasn't worth much, saying, "Go up there sometime." "No," I said. "I'm not doing this to the family. I'm doing this for the company." There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel that way right now. The agreement was signed before the end of the month. The forensic audit took 4 months. The total amount recovered and documented was $318,000, slightly less than my grandfather's estimate, which meant his records had been conservative, not exaggerated. My mother and brother liquidated a joint investment account and a rental property they'd owned together to fund the repayment. The financial oversight structure Sandra had proposed was formalized in the company's bylaws. I went back to work in January. The CFO, to his credit, apologized to me privately. He'd known something was wrong, he said, but he hadn't known the scope, and he hadn't known what to do. I told him I appreciated that he said it. I told him the way forward was to do better, and I meant it. My brother has remained with the company in a limited capacity. My mother stepped back from the chair role and moved to an advisory position with no voting rights. It isn't warm between us, any of it. Maybe it never will be. That's a loss I've had to make my peace with, and I'm still making it, if I'm honest. But the company is intact. The projects are running. The people who depend on those paychecks are still employed. My grandfather built something worth protecting. I still go to the cabin as often as I can, most weekends between April and October, and a week or two in the winter when I can manage it. I finished the bathroom renovation last spring. The interior trim is done. Trev helped me build a proper dock down at the water. Pressure-treated framing with cedar decking, and the first morning I sat at the end of it, with a coffee in the early light. With the lake absolutely still and the loons calling somewhere out of sight, I thought about my grandfather making this drive 40, 50 years ago. Pulling up to what was then a newer building, carrying his gear down to the water. He'd have been about my age. I keep his letter in the cabin, in the hidden room that isn't hidden anymore, on the shelf above the small window that looks out at the lake. I don't read it often, but sometimes, when a decision feels too big or too complicated, I'll go in there and hold for a minute. I don't need to read it again. I remember what it says. He said he trusted my judgment. He said it was something he hadn't said enough when he was there to say it. I think about that a lot. How often the most important things are the ones we assume the other person already knows. How easy it is to let the days go by without saying what actually matters, because you think there will be more days. There won't always be more days. That's the thing. There won't always be more days. So I try to say it now, when I mean it. I try to say it while I can, and when I can't find the words, I go up to the cabin. I sit at the end of the dock. I watch the light come across the water the way it does in the early morning up there, gold and thin and impossibly clean. And I think, he knew. He always knew exactly what he was doing.